carefully choreographed theater of Prime Minister's questions, where government ministers typically deflect difficult inquiries through pre-prepared attack lines, where straightforward questions about democratic processes are met with character assassinations and diversions, and where the convention has been that prime ministers at least attempt to address the substance of queries before pivoting to partisan attacks. Anderson challenged Sir Keir Starmer over delayed local elections in a fiery clash that exposed the government's apparent unwillingness to guarantee that democratic votes will actually take place. The Reform UK MP called on the Prime Minister to guarantee that council ballots postponed earlier this year and those due to take place next May would go ahead, noting that whilst the Labour frontbench continued to peddle their own form of dog whistle politics, Reform UK are cracking on with the day job, identifying savings of over £330 million in their first 6 months leading councils. Anderson challenged Starmer directly, saying, "Go on, be a man, guarantee that elections will proceed." But rather than providing straightforward answer to straightforward question about whether democratic elections will be held as scheduled, Starmer responded with attack on Nigel Farage over allegations about racist behavior during school days, completely ignoring the question about elections whilst demonstrating that when Labour cannot defend their decisions, they resort to character assassination rather than democratic accountability. Welcome to UK Bulletin Report, where we expose the truth about how Starmer's refusal to guarantee that local elections will proceed represents contempt for democratic process, and how Reform's concerns that votes were pushed back in areas where they would perform best creates legitimate questions about whether Labour is manipulating electoral calendar for partisan advantage. Subscribe now for daily analysis that refuses to accept that questions about delayed elections can be dismissed through attacks on unrelated allegations, and that insists prime ministers who claim to respect democracy should be able to provide simple yes or no answer to whether scheduled elections will actually take place or whether they will be further postponed for reasons that suspiciously align with Labour's electoral interests. The substance of Anderson's question deserves examination before we address Starmer's non-response. Council elections were postponed earlier this year in certain areas due to what government characterized as local government shakeup. Reform UK has claimed these postponements occurred in areas where they would perform best, which raises obvious question about whether electoral calendar is being manipulated for partisan advantage. The right to vote at regular intervals is fundamental to democracy. When elections are postponed, particularly in areas where insurgent parties are expected to perform well, the burden is on government to provide compelling justification and to guarantee that postponed votes will actually occur rather than being indefinitely delayed. Anderson's request for guarantee that all council elections from this year and proposed local elections for next year will go ahead in May 2024 is not unreasonable or a trick question. This is straightforward inquiry about whether democratic process will be respected. Either the elections will proceed or they will not. Either the government commits to holding votes as scheduled or it does not. The fact that Starmer could not or would not provide simple answer is revealing about Labour's approach to electoral democracy when that democracy threatens their political interests. The framing that whilst the Labour frontbench continue to peddle their own form of dog whistle politics, Reform UK are cracking on with the day job establishes important contrast. Dog whistle politics refers to coded messaging designed to appeal to particular constituencies whilst maintaining plausible deniability about actual intent. Anderson is accusing Labour of engaging in exactly this behavior, whilst Reform focuses on governance and delivery. The claim that Reform-led councils have already identified savings of over £330 million in first 6 months provides concrete evidence of what cracking on with day job means. These are not theoretical efficiencies or projected savings. These are identified savings from councils that Reform actually leads, which demonstrates capacity to govern effectively and to find resources that previous administrations either could not or would not find. This context makes the election question particularly pointed. If Reform is demonstrating governing competence at local level, if they are finding hundreds of millions in savings that Labour and Conservative councils apparently missed, if they are delivering for residents who elected them, then the logical next step is allowing voters in other areas to decide whether they want similar governance. Postponing elections in areas where Reform would perform well prevents this democratic choice from being exercised, which serves Labour's interests by delaying potential Reform advances, but which subverts democratic process. The direct challenge to Starmer, "Go on, be a man,"
is deliberately provocative language designed to goad Prime Minister into responding substantively. Anderson is suggesting that providing simple guarantee about elections requires basic political courage and integrity, that answering yes or no is test of whether Starmer possesses these qualities. This is political theater, certainly, but it is theater designed to expose substantive issue. Will the Prime Minister guarantee that elections will proceed, or will he evade and deflect because he cannot make that guarantee or because doing so would be politically inconvenient?
Starmer's response revealed that he chose evasion and deflection over substantive answer. Rather than addressing the question about elections, rather than providing the guarantee that Anderson requested, rather than explaining why elections were postponed and when they will definitely occur, Starmer responded with attack on Nigel Farage over allegations about racist behavior during school days. The Prime Minister said he did not realize Anderson is quite so good at stand-up comedy, which is dismissive characterization of legitimate question about democratic process. He then pivoted to claiming that Farage had said he did not have time to condemn racist comments of fellow MP or party calling children in care evil, before wondering whether Anderson can ask his leader whether he has time for explanation for stories in today's papers. This response is revealing in multiple ways. First, it completely ignores the question about elections. Starmer provided no answer whatsoever about whether postponed elections will proceed, whether May 2024 date will be honored, or what guarantees government can offer about electoral calendar. This is Prime Minister refusing to answer direct question about fundamental democratic process. Second, the response attacks Farage personally over unrelated allegations rather than engaging with the policy question raised. This is classic deflection tactic where politician facing difficult question changes subject to attack opponent's character rather than defending their own position. Third, the characterization of Anderson's question as stand-up comedy dismisses legitimate democratic concern as joke, which reveals contempt for both the question and for the democratic principle it raises. The substantive content of Starmer's attack on Farage deserves brief examination. The allegations about racist behavior during school days are serious if true, but they are also completely irrelevant to question about whether local elections will be held as scheduled. The claim that Farage said he did not have time to condemn racist comments or comments about children in care may or may not be accurate characterization of his statements, but even if accurate, it does not answer question about elections. The suggestion that Anderson should ask his leader about explanations for stories in papers is an attempt to make Anderson responsible for defending Farage rather than Starmer being responsible for answering question about government's electoral plans. This is deflection of most cynical kind, when you cannot answer question on merits, when you cannot defend your decisions, when providing straightforward answer would be politically damaging or would reveal problematic intentions, you change the subject to attack opponent's character. This is politics at its worst, where democratic accountability is subverted through character assassination and where prime ministers who claim to respect democratic norms refuse to guarantee that democratic elections will actually occur. Farage's spokesman later saying he denies the allegations and could take legal action is relevant because it suggests that Starmer is using potentially defamatory claims to deflect from legitimate policy questions. If allegations are false, then Prime Minister is using Parliament's privilege to make accusations he could not safely make outside chamber. If allegations are true, they are still irrelevant to question about election timing. Either way, Starmer's response represents failure to engage with democratic accountability. The broader pattern is what makes this exchange particularly significant. This is not isolated incident of Prime Minister evading difficult question. This is consistent pattern where Labour government refuses to provide straightforward answers about democratic processes, electoral calendars, and decisions that affect when and whether voters get to exercise their franchise. The postponement of elections in areas where reform would perform well-created legitimate questions about partisan manipulation of electoral calendar. Anderson's request for guarantee that these elections will actually occur was an attempt to hold government accountable for respecting democratic process. Starmer's refusal to provide that guarantee whilst attacking Farage over unrelated allegations reveals government that views democratic accountability as obstacle to be evaded rather than as fundamental responsibility to be honored. The claim that elections were postponed due to local government shakeup requires scrutiny because it raises questions about whether administrative reorganization is genuine reason or convenient excuse. Local government reorganizations can be legitimate policy decisions that require electoral adjustments. But when those reorganizations conveniently postpone elections in areas where government's political opponents are expected to perform well, when those postponements occur without clear guarantees about when postponed elections will actually be held,
When Prime Minister refuses to provide simple assurance that democratic votes will proceed as rescheduled, the pattern suggests partisan manipulation rather than administrative necessity. Reform's performance in councils they currently lead provides important context because it demonstrates that their electoral success is not merely protest vote but reflects genuine capacity to govern effectively and to deliver savings and services that traditional parties have failed to deliver. The identification of £330 million in savings across reform-led councils in just 6 months is extraordinary achievement that suggests massive waste and inefficiency in how most councils operate. If reform can find these savings whilst maintaining or improving services which the claim implies, then voters in other areas have legitimate interest in deciding whether they want similar governance. Postponing elections prevents this choice from being exercised. The political stakes are enormous because reform represents fundamental challenge to political establishment of both Labour and Conservatives. If reform demonstrates governing competence at local level, if they deliver financial savings and effective services, if they prove that insurgent party can actually govern rather than merely protest, then pathway opens for them to become serious contender for national government. Labour and Conservatives both have interest in preventing or delaying this development, which is why postponement of elections in areas where reform would perform well raises such serious questions about partisan manipulation of democratic process. Lee Anderson's challenge to Starmer to be a man and guarantee that elections will proceed was more than theatrical flourish. It was challenge to Prime Minister to demonstrate basic commitment to democratic principles by providing straightforward answer to straightforward question. When Prime Ministers cannot or will not guarantee that scheduled elections will actually occur, when they deflect questions about electoral calendar through character assassination, when they treat democratic accountability as joke to be dismissed rather than as responsibility to be honored, the foundations of democratic governance are being eroded.
Starmer's refusal to provide that answer, his pivot to personal attacks on Farage, his dismissal of legitimate democratic concern as stand-up comedy, all reveal government that views democracy as inconvenience rather than as fundamental principle. Whether postponed elections will actually proceed remains unanswered question because Prime Minister refused to answer it. That refusal tells us everything we need to know about Labour's respect for democracy when democracy threatens their political interests.